Hello and welcome to an Avro Lancaster bomber. This is one of 7,000 built during World War II, and it was one of the most significant aircraft of the entire war. In this video I'm going to take you on a detailed tour of this aircraft. First we're going to walk around the outside and I'm going to explain the unique design features, and then we're going to crawl inside. We're going to start right down the back at the gunner's tail, and then we'll finish up at the cockpit. So let's get into it. I make videos about planes. If you enjoy flight reports and reviews of flights from around the world and me crawling through significant aircraft in museums, then check out my channel. Make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. In the mid-1930s, the British Air Ministry announced the requirement for a new large bomber, and their preference had two engines simply because resources were so scarce. Avro released the Manchester, which was powered by two Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. Unfortunately, it was underpowered and unreliable, and the rest of the world was moving towards four smaller engines to power their bombers. So Avro upgraded the Manchester, enlarging the wings, and installed four smaller Rolls-Royce Merlins, and then you have the Lancaster. Now it's hard to appreciate the proportions of the Lancaster from above, so let's have a look from the ground level. The four Merlins drove the three blade propellers that were 4 meters in diameter. And while it wasn't optimal, it could fly home with only two operating engines, while it could maintain altitude for a limited distance on a single operating engine. The two main landing gears are interesting for two reasons. Firstly, the tyres were massive, and that's because most runways back then were rough grass, and being in England, they were often wet. Smaller tyres would have simply sunk down under the aircraft's weight. And the other point to make is that it raises up into recesses underneath the inboard engines, leaving the entire underside of the fuselage free for the bombay. And speaking about that, here's the whole purpose of this aircraft: the bombs. These ones already attached were standard 500-pound bombs, although these guys below were a little bigger. The one in the centre was 4,000 pounds or 1.8 tons and was designed to destroy a large building or a street, and was named the blockbuster bomb or cookie. Next to that is the 12,000 pounds or 5.5 ton super cookie, which is just bigger and does more damage. And in the distance there, and I'll walk over there later, is the Upkeep bouncing bomb used in the dam busting raids. Now, as well as these traditional bombs, there were also incendiaries, which worked not by the explosion, but by starting fires. These were like napalm and would keep fires going well after the planes had left. These were small and could be carried around the much larger, more traditional bombs. In fact, here's a photo of incendiary bombs surrounding a cookie bomb under a Lancaster. The Lanc also carried the even bigger Grand Slam 22,000 pound or 10 ton bombs that could penetrate 4 meters of concrete. It's incredible to consider a bomb that size when the aircraft itself only weighed 16 tons. And just in front of the bomb bay is the bomber aims spot, and we'll go inside there later on. So back over to the engines, which were liquid-cooled 27-litre V12 Merlins that produced around 1,280 horsepower or 950 kilowatts. They've removed some of the cowlings so that you can have a look inside this one. And actually, just opposite, here's a Merlin from a Spitfire. So one of the advantages of using these engines was that these parts could be shared between multiple aircraft that use them, including the Spitfire, which is also on display right here. Sharing so much of the design kept costs and complexity down and allowed for sharing of parts and even maintenance crews. Because the Lancaster was operating from small airports, it needed wings that could create a lot of lift, and you can see these split flaps which have been extended below the wing's trailing edge. These essentially worked by increasing lift, although, and this is a bit off topic, check out my Boeing 747 tour videos for their incredible triple slotted flaps which increase the lift by up to 90%. Now as we walk towards the back, what really stands out is the unique tail design, with the large twin elliptical fins and rudder arrangement, which has a number of advantages. If a single fin with the same surface area was used, it would be much larger and taller, therefore requiring a much larger hangar. It also has the advantages of redundancy because if one is damaged, the other one can continue to control the aircraft. The tail is also operating directly in the propeller slipstream, giving it greater rudder authority, and the Lanc was known for great handling characteristics. In fact, there were stories of them outmaneuvering attacking fighters. It also freed up the space to give the rear gunner an unobstructed view of those pesky attacking fighters. I'm not sure it's as beautiful as the Lockheed Super Constellation with the 3 tails you can see now, although it was highly functional nonetheless. And just before we head inside, here's the infamous Upkeep bouncing bomb. Germany had a number of large dams which the Brits were keen to burst, and hitting them from above would have been pretty difficult, and they were also most vulnerable at the base of the dam. Torpedoes were considered, but the Germans installed torpedo nets. Then Barnes-Wallis came up with the idea of a circular bomb that would skip over the top of the water and then hit the dam. It would then drop via gravity and then at a set depth explode, creating a massive shockwave that would hopefully destroy the dam. In fact, here's a photo of one of the dams in Germany after a visit from a Lancaster. To stop it from sinking as soon as it hit the water, they would spin it backwards, and that required a motor to start the spinning at 5,000 RPM before it was released. Here's a photo of it in place under the Lancaster, and you can see the chain that would make it spin. When it was time to release it, the 2 arms on the side would pull out laterally and it would fall down. Now for my favourite part, let's head inside this incredible piece of engineering. One of the first things you notice is how narrow the fuselage is. In fact, it's so tight that the crew couldn't even wear their parachutes because there simply wasn't enough room to move around. They'd have them sitting nearby and have to grab them and strap them on while the aircraft was going down. We'll head down to the tail and visit the rear gunner's position. But first up is the lavatory, which has an important warning written on it so that you wouldn't put your foot through it and into the mud. The contents weren't dropped out, by the way. It was simply a bucket with some chemicals in it that would be emptied by whoever used it during the flight. We'll crawl and slide our way down into the rear gunner's position. This guy, who was one of 7 crew members, was stuck down the back all alone. That spot on the left is where his parachute would sit, and I'll come back to that. He'd slide down into this, frankly, incredibly uncomfortable spot for the duration of the flight. These doors would close, forming the rear of the turret and also his seat back. Now my back ached after a few minutes, so I can only imagine what it would have been like for a few hours. Most Lancasters had 4 303s, although this one was fitted with 2 50 caliber guns, and this lever would cock them. In front of you are 50 caliber ammunition, and up here is the gun sight where you'd want the German fighter sitting. Now the whole turret is hydraulically operated, and you controlled it by moving this up and down, and the actual firing is done via these 2 triggers here. Now if the plane was going down and you needed to escape, you would grab the parachute, strap it on, and then turn the whole turret around, opening those 2 slide doors, and then jump out the back. Now up at this altitude it could be as cold as -40, and while the crew all had electrically heated jackets, it would still be very cold. You can imagine that the thin perspex around the turret would have provided no insulation at all. This black pipe on your right was hot air bled from the engine and would provide a small amount of warmth, although from all accounts, the crews still said it was pretty freezing up there. The aircraft skin was just thin metal, with saving weight being the ultimate priority. Now this here is a chute. To ensure the accuracy of their bombing, they would drop photo flash cartridges through here just after dropping the bombs, and they would explode at 1,000 feet and a camera would take 4 photos. They would use these for the damage assessment and to ensure that the crew had actually got to the target. Now down here is a flare gun, and on the other side is a hole, and these were used to communicate with each other. For example, during the attacks on the dams, they would fire a red flare to indicate they've just released a bouncing bomb. And to flood German radar, they could also throw this foil called window out of the chutes. This is the magnetic compass, which is located back here. The reason being is that all of the metal in the bombay further forward would actually interfere with it. The information is then repeated for the pilot and the navigator further forward. On both sides of the fuselage you have these two ammunition tracks moving back towards the rear gunner's position. The ammunition would be kept up here to maintain the centre of gravity rather than having all of the weight right at the back. And here are the ammunition bins where they would sit ready to be used. And just above that is the mid-upper 50 caliber turret. Now you can see parts of the aircraft would have been in the line of fire, so there were blocks in the tracking to stop you from shooting your own tail fins. The mid-upper gunner didn't have a proper seat, other than a single strap across the fuselage that he sat on. On the left here you've got some of the communication and electronic systems, and in front is the flap drive, which we're stepping over. This on the right here is where the hot air enters from being bled from the engine. Next step is over the secondary wing spar, and then on the left is the casualty station. Just above you is another escape hatch, which otherwise provides a great view. You're about to see a collection of nitrogen cylinders, and these are used to replace the fuel inside the gas tanks. Now, as the fuel is burnt by the engines, the tanks would otherwise fill with air and fuel vapour, which would be quite explosive if a disagreeable bullet created a spark nearby. Next to that is the escape door from above, and this axe would be used if the door got bent during a crash landing and needed some encouragement to open. On the left is a hydraulic fluid tank, and in front is the main wing spar, which I'll now attempt to step over. On the left here is the radio operator's position. Now, because most of the flight was in radio silence, this guy would do all the other odd jobs such as dropping foil and ensuring the bombs had been released. You've got the radio communication systems here, and above is an astrodome that the navigator would use with a sextant to use the stars to identify their location. And down here is a Morse code machine. Moving on, we'll jump into the navigator's seat. On the left is a GH radio navigation system, which worked with several ground stations transmitting pulse signals to the aircraft and therefore helping it work out its location. To the right is the compass display, for the compass further back that I pointed out earlier. Further around is the airspeed indicator and the altimeter. To read the charts, the navigator needed a white light, and this whole station would be surrounded by a curtain as to not affect everyone else's night vision. This machine is the display from the H2S radar, which replaced the ventral gun turret, and I'll point that out later. This would provide a distinct different display for water, open land, and built-up towns or cities that would help the aircraft work out its location. On the right side now was the flight engineer's panel, where they could monitor parameters such as the oil pressure and fuel management. I'll come back to the engineer, and let's jump into the pilot seat, and yes, there's only one of them simply because there was just a shortage of people for the war effort in general. That view out to the left, by the way, was pretty cool. The museum has this awesome virtual reality show where you actually join a Lancaster crew on their flight to Germany, and you get views like this, but all lit up like an actual war zone. It's actually very realistic and fascinating to see. So in front is the control column, and there was no hydraulic support for this, just pulleys directly moving the flight controls. In front of you, you'll see what looks like quite a messy, blind flying instrument panel, which doesn't quite fit. The idea was that multiple different aircraft would share identical parts that could be used interchangeably. Here is the same panel inside a Spitfire, so this was just a simple trick to reduce the complexity with parts that were already scarce. In the centre here is a repeater from the magnetic compass further back in the plane and a turn and bank indicator. These here are 4 throttle controls, and below that controls the propeller's positions. And on the right, you've got your trim controls. Now this green thing here is actually the flight engineer's seat that would fold up. Now during takeoff, they had the important job of moving the throttles forward, as a pilot's hand would be full with the heavy yoke. If the engine stops during flight, the prop itself would create a large amount of drag, so one of those red buttons will feather it, which essentially turns it sideways so that air moves past smoothly. And the red buttons below that were the fire extinguishers. But after takeoff, the flight engineer would put away those seats and then return to looking at that panel that I showed you earlier. We'll now move down and look into the bomb aimer's position. The forward escape hatch has been removed, and that's why I couldn't get down into it. On the extreme left is the hatch itself, and next to that is the bombing computer. The aimer enters the information such as wind, velocity and altitude, and that drives his bomb sight. So he would be lying face down in the center here and looking through the large circular perspex blister at the front, and that device on the right was involved with the timing of the bomb release. 3 miles out from the target, the bomb aimer would take over the navigator's role, directing the pilot towards the target. In later models, they could actually directly steer the aircraft itself. Now above this spot is the forward turret, which you can't really see from this angle, so I'll point that out from the outside. The bomb aimer did both the aiming and operating that turret. Now as we climb back, you'll get a good recap of where we've just walked. Now add in the noise, the fumes, leaking oil, it would have been freezing, and everything you touch would be stone cold. And then there'd be the existential angst knowing that for much of the flight, you could be blown out of the sky without a moment's notice. In fact, over half of the 7,377 Lancasters built were lost in combat, and 55,573 died serving for the Bomber Command during the war. Now, I really enjoy crawling around and appreciating the mechanical aspects of these aircraft, but it's important that we recognise the human side as well. The vast majority of crews were sourced from the UK and the colonies, and were in their late teens and early 20s, and they would be committed to a tour of 30 operational flights. Obviously, they were very keen to get those 30 completed, although they would only count if there was photographic evidence that the target had been hit, hence why they took those photos that I mentioned earlier. It really was a dangerous job, with 51% of them killed in operation, 12% killed or wounded in non-operational accidents, and 13% became POWs. Only 24%, or just under a quarter, survived the war unscathed. Now shortly, you'll see some windows down here that provide a view into the bomb bay. Now if there was damage or malfunction that resulted in bombs getting stuck, they look down here and then pull the manual bomb jettison up in the cockpit. If that didn't work, the pilot then might just weave around aggressively in the hope of dislodging it, but otherwise they'd just have to land with the bombs on board. This large circle used to house the ventral gunner's position, although they realised that it had a poor range of view and wasn't particularly effective, so they replaced it with the H2S ground radar that I mentioned earlier. These were flying at night, so this tool became invaluable to help them work out where they were. Unfortunately, the Germans worked out how to detect these radars and use them to launch their own attacks. Here we are underneath, looking up through the escape hatch that we saw earlier. It's difficult to see, but this thing here would fold down and form the gun turret seat. Here it is from the side, and you can see that it's above but a little behind the bomb aimer's spot. And finally, the nose art. The J0D for Digger was the squadron code. These 2 swastikas were for 2 German aircraft destroyed in flight, and then there was the number of the night raids and then day raids. and then a cartoon was just for fun. And finally, a massive thanks to the Aviation Heritage Museum in Perth for letting me film this aircraft. They've got a great selection of aircraft on display, including a Catalina, C-47 Canberra bomber, an F-111 injection seat, and many others. Just make sure you book the tours ahead of time to avoid disappointment, and you'll get your very own experienced guide with a lot more stories than what I've had time to tell you now. And if you've got this far, don't forget to check out my channel for many more similar aviation tours, including a B-52, 747s, 707, Super Connie, and many others. Thanks for watching.